How many times in life have you felt invisible? How many times have you given your best, expecting nothing in return, and realized that maybe it was that very act of kindness that changed everything? The story you're about to hear is exactly about that. About an ordinary woman, just like me and you, named Grace. A woman who carried something rare inside her, something no amount of money could ever buy. The ability to see beyond appearances. She was simple. She worked in a small bakery filled with memories, old recipes, and a past that refused to go away. And on a rainy afternoon, just as she was about to close the shop, Grace decided to share the last slice of her favorite cake with a stranger, a delivery man who walked in soaked, a little lost, through the front door. It was just a small gesture. A simple act of kindness that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by him. What Grace didn't know was that this man, who seemed ordinary, was hiding a secret that could either shatter the trust slowly building between them, or change both their lives forever. Sometimes, the most beautiful stories are born just like that, between shared silences, quiet gestures, and a final piece of something meaningful given to someone who, without you knowing, might be exactly who you needed to meet. But what about you? Have you ever had someone walk into your life, seemingly insignificant, and leave behind a mark you could never forget? Then stay with me, because this story is for you. It's about real love, about learning to trust again, even after you've been hurt, about forgiveness, second chances, and the courage to open your heart one more time. And if you've ever been afraid to let someone in again, afraid to love after being broken, listen closely, because Grace and Elijah will show you that true love doesn't need grand gestures or perfect promises. It just needs to be real. It needs to show up when no one else does. It needs to be brave enough to return, even when everything seems lost. So settle in, take a deep breath, and get ready to feel this story with your heart, because it begins right now. The light rain fell like a veil over the fogged windows of Sweet Memory Bakery as Grace cut the last slice of chocolate cake with strawberries. It was an old recipe from her grandmother, one she baked whenever she needed to remember who she was. The customers had already left, and the clock hands seemed to move slower that afternoon. Alone, she looked at the plate and thought about saving it for herself, until she heard the door open with the soft chime of the old bell. A man walked in, soaked, holding a cardboard box with the logo of a supply distributor. He had a quiet smile and attentive eyes, but nothing about him screamed status. Only silence. He stopped near the counter, slowly pulling down his hood. "Sorry to drop by this late. I'm covering for a colleague. First delivery here." Grace smiled naturally, even though the day had been anything but easy. "Then you're right on time. Want a slice of cake?" He chuckled, surprised. "Do you offer cake to every new delivery guy?" She shrugged, amused. "Only to the ones dripping wet who look like they need warmth more than a box." And she pointed to the stool beside her. He sat down, not quite sure how to react. They sat side by side, him still balancing the box, her serving 2 slices with old metal forks. "Made by me," she said with quiet pride. He took a bite. Silence. He chewed carefully, then looked at her with a restrained sincerity. "Tastes like a memory." Grace looked at him, caught off guard. No one's ever said that before. He gave a half smile. "My mom used to make a cake like this. It's been a while." The words lingered between crumbs and memories that needed no explanation. "What's your name?" she asked, cleaning the plate's edge with her finger, like she didn't want to waste a single bit. "Eli," he answered, hesitating for a second. He wasn't lying, just hiding the last name that would give him away. "And you?" "Grace. But most people just call me the girl behind the counter." He smiled again, this time more openly. "I think I prefer Grace. It feels more real." The connection wasn't sudden or full of sparks. It was like a warm blanket on a cold day, unexpected, yet comforting. She pointed at the stacked boxes. "Must be heavy, carrying all that around." He answered calmly, "Some weights are lighter than loneliness." Grace fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in, words that felt like they came from someone who knew the ache of emptiness. The sound of the wall clock returned, filling the space between glances. It was as if both of them knew this meeting wasn't ordinary, that something had shifted. Before leaving, Elijah scribbled something quickly on a napkin. "Thanks for the cake and for the comfortable silence." He left the note on the counter next to the empty plate. Grace watched him cross the street, still under the drizzle, disappearing around the corner. Only then did she realize she had served the last slice, the one she had meant for herself. But she didn't regret it. For the first time in days, she felt the flavor of sharing was better than the taste of longing. In the back room, the manager was on the phone discussing the imminent sale of the bakery. "The buyer wants discretion. He'll show up as a regular customer, maybe even a temp worker." Grace didn't hear. She stood by the window, staring at the empty street, sensing that something in her had also been given away that afternoon, though she didn't know what. The smell of cake still lingered in the air, but now it carried something new: curiosity. Elijah, on the other side of the city, stared at the folded napkin he'd kept in his pocket. Her name was written on it with a little flower sketched beside it. "Grace," he murmured in the car, letting her name fill the silence. That simple woman, who shared cake with strangers and offered warmth without expecting anything in return, had made more of an impact on his soul than any business meeting that week. He didn't want to admit it, but he was already hooked, and he hadn't even signed the ownership papers yet. Grace returned to the counter and read his note again. The words were simple, but carried rare kindness. She had served hundreds of people there, but no one had ever written something so direct and tender. She tucked the napkin into the teaspoon drawer, like someone keeping a treasure. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe because she sensed he would return, or maybe because she was already forming a bond with someone she barely knew. That night, the bakery emptied earlier than usual. Grace turned off the lights slowly, as if saying goodbye to every corner. The vintage candy shelf, the always late wall clock, the grandmother's recipe clipped to the fridge. Everything there told someone's story, and she feared it would all be erased soon by a soulless, modern renovation. She sighed, picking up the keys to lock the door. But before leaving, she glanced one last time at the place where Elijah had sat. The stool was still slightly out of place. She smiled, as if he had left a little mess inside her heart too. Meanwhile, Elijah walked down the city sidewalk with his hood up, hair still damp. Beside him, the business assistant spoke excitedly about the deal with the bakery's former owners. "The contract's ready, just needs your signature." But Elijah said nothing. His thoughts were trapped in the taste of that cake and Grace's words. It wasn't just the sweetness, it was everything that came with it. The memory, the gesture, the comforting silence. Something none of the other bakeries he'd visited had ever managed to offer. "Did you hear me, Mr. Carter?" the assistant asked. Elijah just nodded vaguely. He didn't want to speak. He didn't want that connection to be lost amid reports and contract clauses. For a moment, he considered delaying everything. Just a few more days as a delivery guy. Just a few more meetings with Grace. No masks, no titles. He didn't know exactly what he was feeling, but he knew one thing: it was rare. And he didn't waste rare things. The next day, Grace arrived early to work. She had decided to make the same cake again. Something inside her wanted to repeat the gesture. Maybe for herself, maybe hoping he'd return. She placed the batter in the oven and started cleaning the display case, as if preparing the space for someone important. But as soon as she finished, the manager called her. "We need to talk about your contract, Grace." She froze inside. She knew what was coming. The bakery was about to change ownership, and she'd probably be discarded like another outdated item. "You're good, but the new management might want to start fresh," he said, trying to sound kind. Grace took a deep breath and thanked him with a smile that hid the sting. She had lost many things in life already. Maybe they were about to take one more. She returned to the kitchen and pulled the cake out of the oven with more force than necessary. "Let them take everything," she whispered. "But they won't take who I am." It was the only thing she had left at lunchtime. The bakery door opened again with the same bell chime. Elijah walked in with a box in his arms and a restrained smile. "Good morning." Grace turned quickly, nearly tripping over a spoon. "You came back." He nodded. "I was hoping for another slice of that cake." She pointed at the tray. "It's only 20 minutes out of the oven. Fresher than yesterday." The smile between them lasted longer than it should have. Subtle, but full of silent anticipation, like they both knew they were about to repeat something that already meant too much. This time, he was the one who ordered 2 coffees. They sat on the same bench. Elijah, still pretending to be a delivery guy, asked about the recipe. Grace told him about her grandmother, her simple childhood, and afternoons where flour was treated like gold. She used to say a good cake brings people together, and that life is like raw batter. It needs heat to rise. Elijah stayed quiet, watching the steam rise from his cup. He was hearing more than words. He was hearing a past that could have been his, too. Suddenly, she stopped and looked into his eyes. "You seem like someone who's running from something." Elijah froze. It wasn't an accusation, just an honest, almost maternal observation. "Sometimes we're not running, just looking for the right place to stop," he replied, voice low and rough. Grace nodded. She knew what it was like not to belong anywhere. That dialogue, between slices and crumbs, was stitching something together that words alone could never explain. They were recognizing each other. The conversation lingered for a few more minutes. Elijah hesitated to leave. Grace, inside, didn't want him to. But the bakery wasn't a fairy tale. Reality waited in the back room. The manager peeked through the door, curious about the strange friendship forming. When Elijah left, he took more than cake. He took memory. And Grace, for the first time in a long while, felt she had given something to someone and received something money couldn't buy. And outside, the world carried on, unaware that a love had just begun there. Not with promises, not with roses, but with a last slice of cake shared on a rainy day between 2 strangers who were tired of not being seen. The next morning, Grace arrived earlier than usual. She had dreamed of the delivery man, not a romantic dream, but one of those that leave quiet questions hanging in the soul. In it, Elijah was in the bakery's kitchen, not carrying boxes, but flipping through old recipes. He smiled like someone who had known that place for years. When she woke up, her chest felt tight. It wasn't common for someone to stir her like this, especially so quickly. The manager was in a bad mood early on. The buyer's visit was postponed. They said he'll show up as a regular customer, maybe even in disguise. Grace simply nodded, hiding the growing tension with practiced ease. The bakery was her second home, knowing it would soon be sold and likely stripped of its essence, hurt more than she liked to admit. The only thing still holding her together was her silent ritual with her grandmother's cake and those brief encounters with the calm-eyed delivery man. Elijah returned late in the afternoon, carrying another box and his hood still pulled low. Grace greeted him with a reserved smile, pretending it was just another ordinary day. But her heart raced. "There's no cake today, but I have some leftover apple pie," she said, trying to sound casual. He accepted eagerly, as if the offer itself was sweeter than any dessert. They sat again on the bench by the counter. They were forming a routine, and neither of them wanted to break it. "Have you always been this kind to strangers?" Elijah asked, his eyes fixed on hers. Grace chuckled softly. "I guess I learned that the ones who need kindness the most rarely ask for it." He stayed quiet for a moment. He wanted to tell her the truth, to admit he wasn't just a delivery guy, that he already owned the bakery on paper. But something held him back. She was kind to him without knowing who he was. And for someone like him, that was rare, more precious than gold. In the back room, the phone rang. The manager rushed out, whispering instructions to someone on the other end. Elijah, always alert, caught words like contract and remodel, but pretended not to hear. Grace, on the other hand, seemed unaware of the tension, or maybe she was pretending to. She set 2 coffees on the table and smiled. "I still don't know your last name." Elijah hesitated. "Just Eli. That's enough for now." She didn't press. She respected silence. That was another thing that captivated him about her. She didn't ask to invade, but to connect. Their connection deepened, even in the quiet. There were no grand gestures, no promises. But there was something in the way she casually straightened his shirt sleeve, or how he always brought extra napkins without being asked. It was the kind of care that builds slowly, without noise. And, for that reason, it lasts longer. Grace noticed he liked to observe things. The old paintings on the wall, the faded sign at the entrance, the handwritten recipe books. She commented, a bit embarrassed. "Most people think this place is too old." Elijah replied firmly, "That's what gives it soul." Her heart held on to that phrase long after he left. No one had ever spoken of the bakery like that before. Only someone who understood the value of roots could find beauty in cracks. That night, Elijah met with the architect assigned to remodel the bakery. He handed the project back. "Put everything on hold for now." The architect tried to protest. But Mr. Carter, the new design, Elijah cut him off with a single gesture. "If I renovate this place like all the others, it'll lose what really matters. I'm not destroying something with soul just to make it look modern." For the first time, the cold businessman was being guided by his heart. Meanwhile, Grace was writing in her journal, hidden between bags of flour. It was the only place she allowed herself to dream. She wrote about the delivery guy with the gentle eyes, about the mystery he carried, and how something inside her stirred every time he walked through the door. "It's not love, not yet, but it's a strange feeling that I want him to stay." She finished the sentence and closed the notebook before her cheeks turned red. This feeling was new and terrifying. Time began shaping their meetings. Elijah always came in the late afternoon. Grace always had something fresh for him to taste. The manager was growing suspicious but said nothing. Customers began to notice the exchanged smiles and lingering glances. "I think the girl at the counter has a crush on the delivery boy," an older woman whispered to her friend. And even though Grace pretended not to hear, her heart did flips just thinking it might be true. One day, Elijah brought a different box. Inside was a small jar of artisanal honey. "I remembered you said your grandma used this in everything." Grace smiled, touched. "How do you remember these things?" He answered simply, "When you listen with your heart, you don't forget." She went silent. She wanted to hug him right then, but she held back. She didn't know who he really was, only what he made her feel. And for now, that was enough. The manager finally set the date for the official handover. In a week, the new owner takes over. Renovations should begin immediately. Grace felt the ground shake beneath her feet. Everything she knew, everything she loved about that place, was about to vanish. Everything except the delivery man. He was the only constant. And ironically, the one she still wasn't sure she could trust. That evening, Elijah stayed longer than usual. He watched the street, darkened from the bakery's front window. "Are you afraid of what comes next?" he asked. Grace looked down at her hands. "I'm afraid that everything I've been won't have a place to belong anymore." He nodded quietly. Her words hit a wound of his own. Because despite everything he had, Elijah still felt out of place. In luxury homes, at fancy dinners, in boardrooms full of flattery. But here, in this simple bakery, he finally felt like he belonged. Grace offered him one last cup of tea before closing. They sat in silence, knowing that the right words aren't always spoken, but felt. Elijah held the mug with both hands, as if trying to warm more than just his fingers. And in that moment, between crumbs of pie, quiet breaths, and suspended gazes, something was born. Still without a name, still without shape, but with roots already deep. Outside, the city slept. But inside, in the warmth of an old kitchen, Two hearts had just begun to awaken to something you can't plan for. Morning arrived with the scent of fresh bread and anxiety. Grace tried to stick to her routine, but everything felt like it was about to change. The bakery would officially be sold in just a few days, and every familiar detail now stung like a farewell. Even though Elijah still came every day, she knew she couldn't count on him forever. He was just a temporary delivery man, and she was an employee about to lose her job. Still, her heart insisted on hoping. Elijah watched everything with careful eyes. He already knew Grace's every step, every movement as she worked the dough, every quiet expression when the place grew empty. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. For the first time in years, he saw himself in someone. But he couldn't delay it any longer. In just a few days, everyone would know he wasn't just a delivery guy, he was the new owner. And he feared that once Grace found out, the sweet bond between them would turn bitter. That afternoon, Elijah showed up earlier than usual. He brought simple flowers, picked from the garden of his mother's old home. They weren't luxurious, but they had history, just like her. Grace looked surprised. Flowers now, he smiled. It's just that, today, the smell in here reminded me of her, and I thought you'd understand. She took the bouquet gently. I do, and thank you. It was the first time she touched him without realizing, and the first time he wished time would freeze in that moment. Grace, he began, his voice uncertain, if everything changed here, would you still bake cakes? She laughed, not really understanding. Baking is how I stay standing, even when everything else around me falls apart. Elijah swallowed hard. Her words hit him deep. He wanted to tell her, to say, I'm the new owner, but I don't want to change anything about you. But he said nothing. Was it cowardice? Maybe. Or just fear. Fear of losing the only person who saw him for who he truly was. The next day, a man in a suit walked into the bakery asking for Grace. He said he was from the new administration. We're evaluating staff profiles. Do you know how to use spreadsheets? Grace froze. Spreadsheets? This was a bakery, not an office. If you give me flour and affection, I can work miracles. But numbers aren't really my thing. The man jotted something down and left. Grace felt her throat tighten. For the first time, she was truly afraid of losing everything. Elijah arrived shortly after and saw the look on her face. What happened? She hesitated, then told him. He stayed quiet. He didn't know what hurt more, seeing her treated like she was disposable, or knowing his name was at the bottom of it all. Grace, what if you had the chance to start over? Somewhere else. She shook her head. I don't want somewhere else. I want this place. With its cracks, its old smells, its soul. That night, Elijah made a decision. He called his lawyer. I want to change the terms. She can't be fired. Not her recipes. Not her way. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. But that goes against your investment strategy. Elijah responded firmly. This time, it's not just about the investment. And he hung up. For the first time, Elijah Carter was choosing heart over numbers. Grace traced her fingers along the edges of a tray covered in hardened frosting, as if searching for answers there. It was strange how someone who'd shown up so recently could take up so much space inside her. Since Elijah started coming to the bakery, everything had shifted. Their conversations, the coffee breaks, the silences filled with meaning. But now, something was changing. And deep down, she knew there was more to him than he let on. Outside, the sun played hide-and-seek behind the clouds, and the breeze carried the scent of dried leaves from the square across the street. Elijah arrived at his usual time, but without a delivery box. He wore a simple knit sweater and carried a folder tucked under his arm. No deliveries today, Grace asked, trying to sound casual. Today, I just wanted to try the cake, if there's any. She served 2 slices, but she noticed something different in his eyes. They carried a weight he was trying hard to hide. They sat on the bench by the window. Elijah stirred his coffee slowly, as if afraid to spill anything, especially words. Grace watched him, resisting the urge to ask what she most wanted to know. until he spoke. Have you ever felt like you had to lie just to be accepted? The question caught her off guard. Yes, when I was a kid, pretending it didn't bother me to eat stale bread at school while the others had proper snacks. They looked at each other. It was like they had opened a window they'd both kept closed for too long. Sometimes I think people only see me when I hide who I really am, he said. Grace nodded. Some people only see the surface, but others, they notice the details. Elijah stared at her. And you see the details. She smiled, then looked away. It was getting too dangerous, that place between friendship and something more. And she already knew how much it hurt to fall for something that wasn't real. The next morning, Grace arrived late. She hadn't been able to sleep, thinking about all the things Elijah didn't say. She felt like something was about to break. And without knowing why, she opened her old recipe notebook. But instead of a regular recipe, she began writing something new, a mix of affection, time, and trust. She wrote, "First, blend truth with courage. Then, add a pinch of shared silence. And finally, leave it in the oven of time until both know this is real." Meanwhile, Elijah sat in his car outside the bakery, watching the street traffic without the courage to go in. The folder sat on the passenger seat with the signed contracts. In just a few days, it would all be official. But he feared that revealing his identity would destroy what was beginning to grow between them. As contradictory as it seemed, he had never found it harder to simply be who he really was. He decided to go in as usual. No suits, no declarations. Just himself. The man who still didn't know how to approach someone without scaring them away. Grace greeted him with a calm smile. "Today we have apple pie and mint tea. Comfort food for days that need warmth." Elijah smiled in return. Every word from her felt like silent shelter. They sat down again, and between bites and sips, the silence spoke louder than any explanation. "You always speak with your heart in your hands," he said. "And you seem like someone who keeps your heart folded in your pocket." Grace didn't respond right away. Then she said, "I keep it in my pocket because I've been hurt too many times leaving it out in the open." He nodded, understanding more than he wanted to admit. Their exchange wasn't just about pastries and tea. It was about wounds that recognized each other. Elijah stood up earlier than usual, said he had something to take care of, but promised he'd be back. Grace watched him leave with the folder tucked under his arm and a hesitant stride. She kept her eyes on the door for a long while, half expecting him to return saying he'd forgotten something. But he didn't, and that absence hurt like a small loss. The kind we try to ignore but feel stitched into the seams of the day. Hours later, back at home, Grace opened her notebook and reread the unfinished recipe. She felt like the main ingredient still had no name. Maybe it was truth. Maybe it was courage. Maybe it was him. But she couldn't finish the recipe alone. Some things require two pairs of hands. Across town, Elijah signed the final purchase document. As he stamped his name, something inside him broke too. It wasn't regret. It was the ache of missing her already. The woman who made him believe that real love could bloom in the simplest of things, like sharing a piece of cake on an ordinary day. And in that silence, as the paper was handed to the lawyer, he knew what started with sugar now ached like longing. The bakery woke up with the soft scent of vanilla and tension in the air. Grace arrived before sunrise, as if she needed the silence to think. In the past few days, Elijah's presence had changed the atmosphere of the place, and now his absence was beginning to press into the spaces that once felt full. She no longer knew if she was waiting for a customer, a friend, or something more. All she knew was that she was too involved to pretend she didn't care. In the kitchen, she flipped through her grandmother's recipes as if searching for answers between butter-stained lines. There was one she hadn't touched in years, the orange cake with warm glaze. The one her grandma used to bake when she wanted to forgive someone. Looking at that recipe was like admitting something hurt more than she wanted to admit. But that day, she set out the ingredients. Maybe it was time to face what needed healing. As she cracked the eggs, she thought of their last conversation. The veiled goodbye, the unasked questions. She still didn't know what Elijah was hiding, but she felt the weight of it. When someone speaks with their whole being, absence shouts from every little detail. What once felt like comfort now echoed like noise. The batter was ready, but she hesitated to put it in the oven, as if the symbolic act of forgiveness had to come before the real one. Outside, the city was slowly waking up. Elijah, however, was still sitting in his car, parked 2 blocks away, watching from a distance, like someone trying to gather the courage to fix something he wasn't even sure was broken. The folder with the contracts was no longer with him. It now rested on the bakery counter, between crumbs and cold coffee. What he wanted couldn't fit into letterhead documents. It was something much simpler, and much harder. He finally walked in. Grace didn't turn around right away. No cake today, just batter waiting for courage. Elijah stepped closer in silence. I guess that's something we have in common. She slowly turned to him. He was there, no delivery box, no disguises. Just him, the same man who shared pie, who learned her recipes, who listened to her hurts with calm eyes. But now, he was also the one carrying a secret between them. Grace grabbed 2 mugs and poured tea. If you came looking for forgiveness, you'll have to prove you deserve it. He nodded. I didn't come to ask for anything. I came to offer. She raised an eyebrow. Offer what? Elijah took a deep breath. The right to choose. The bakery is yours as much as mine. I signed the papers. But you're the soul of this place. She stood still, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. She didn't know if it was anger, gratitude, or fear of what it all meant. You lied to me, she said firmly. You pretended to be someone else. Took my time, my trust, my affection. Elijah lowered his eyes. I know, and if I could go back, I'd do it differently. At first, I just wanted to understand the place. But later, I just wanted to understand you. Grace felt her eyes sting, but held back. She wasn't someone who cried easily, especially not in front of someone who had hurt her. Elijah continued. I grew up in a world where no one is real. People are around me for my name, my money. And when you gave me that last piece of cake, without knowing who I was, it was like someone saw me, really saw me, for the first time. Grace's body trembled. That connection she had felt, that silent bond, had been real for him too. And that made everything more complicated. And now, she asked in a near whisper, now I just want you to know that, even owning everything, I've never felt so small before someone as I do with you. Grace said nothing. It wasn't a love declaration, but it was more honest than most promises she'd ever heard. And that, to her, meant more than any rehearsed apology. The next morning, she arrived early again. But this time, she placed the orange cake in the oven without hesitation. It was her way of saying that maybe, just maybe, she was willing to listen again. Elijah arrived mid-morning, unsure if he'd be welcome. She didn't say a word, just served a warm slice on a blue porcelain plate and left it on the counter without asking anything. It's your favorite, isn't it? She said with a gentle smile. Elijah nodded. Tastes like a chance. They sat side by side, as before, looking out the window. They didn't say much, but the silence now was different, less heavy, more open, as if they were carefully testing the bridges that might still be rebuilt. She pulled out an old notebook and handed it to him. It's my recipe book. It's all scribbled, but I think you should see it. Elijah flipped through it with reverence, as if handling something sacred. There's more here than sugar and flour. There are the women who came before me. My childhood. Good days. Hard ones too. He stopped on a page marked with a red ribbon. Last slice, it read. The recipe of the first cake she had ever shared with him. Elijah looked up at her. You gave me that cake without knowing who I was. It was the purest gesture I've received in years. Grace looked away. Maybe that's why it hurt so much when I found out. He nodded. I deserve that. But I also learned. And if you let me, I want to earn the next slice. the one that's still to come. She took a deep breath, trying to hold back the emotion. That sentence wasn't just about cake. It was about everything that might come next in the days that followed. She returned to her routine, but with lighter steps. Elijah came every day, not with the same intensity as before, but with the quiet consistency of someone who wanted to rebuild. They baked together. Clients watched them curiously, but neither of them cared. The kitchen had become a place where forgiveness was mixed with butter and second chances. Grace didn't forget what he had done, but she started to understand why he had done it. And that difference, for her, meant everything. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing to remember with less pain, and slowly building something new in the same place where it once all fell apart. The bakery came back to life, not because of renovations, but because of the stories it held and the new one being written there, day after day. Grace now looked at Elijah with new eyes. He was no longer the delivery guy or the owner. He was just him, full of flaws, but full of truth too. And in that space between mistakes and efforts, they were creating a new recipe. One with no name, no exact measurements, but made with time, presence, and two hearts willing to mix it all again. At the end of that day, Grace closed the bakery a little later than usual. She sat alone on the bench near the front window, staring at the reflection of the darkened sign. She thought of her grandmother, of the times she said forgiveness was like yeast. It needs space and time to rise. And she thought of Elijah, of what he had risked, of what she was willing to reclaim. Not everything could go back to how it was, but maybe something new could grow from that broken place, like bread that still rises even after it collapses. Elijah walked down the street, stopping across from the bakery and seeing her there, sitting. He didn't cross over, just stood in silence, watching. Sometimes, love also meant knowing how to wait. He felt that any word in that moment might disturb the tenderness that was forming. Grace didn't see him, but perhaps she sensed him. It was as if both knew that what mattered now wasn't speed, it was presence. And there, in that quiet sunset, trust began to rise once more. Inside the bakery, the scent of orange cake still lingered in the air. And in the recipe notebook, a new page was being written, slowly, without a title, without guarantees. Just with gestures, glances, and the certainty that sometimes love begins when we dare to mix everything again, even after it's fallen apart once before. The day of the reopening had arrived. The bakery now had light wooden benches, softer lighting, and restored details, but the soul of the place remained the same. Elijah had insisted on keeping the old sign, the crooked wall clock, and the recipe board with Grace's grandmother's handwriting. Everything looked ready for a new chapter, except her heart, which still hesitated between the part that had been wounded and the one that was slowly reborn. Grace arrived before opening time, wearing her light blue apron and the floral scarf her grandmother had given her. She walked through the room in silence, touching every corner as if checking whether it still belonged to her. She felt torn. The bakery was alive, beautiful, full of people, but now it had an owner. And even though she felt something strong for him, the fact that he had deceived her still stung like a fresh wound. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Locals, curious journalists, and loyal customers all mixed together, eager to meet the mysterious new owner. Elijah hadn't shown up yet. Grace was preparing the display case with cakes and pies like she always did, but her fingers trembled slightly as she arranged the napkins. His words echoed in her mind. "I didn't mean to deceive you. I just wanted to know if you'd see me, even without knowing who I was." When the doorbell rang, everyone turned. Elijah walked in with no fanfare, no suit, just his usual gray shirt and the same eyes, tired but steady. The manager introduced him enthusiastically as the businessman behind the bakery's revival. But Elijah gently interrupted. "I'm not here as a businessman today. I came as someone who found something here he didn't even know he was searching for: truth. Grace stayed silent behind the counter. His eyes searched for hers, but she didn't give in. Not there. Not in front of everyone. Elijah continued. This bakery wasn't bought with money. It was built through affection. And all of this only makes sense because she, Grace, is here. The crowd applauded, touched by his speech. But Grace felt her throat tighten. To her, it wasn't about applause. It was about trust. As the crowd began to disperse, Elijah approached slowly. Can I talk to you? Grace nodded without a smile. They went to the kitchen, where the light was dimmer and words could carry their true weight. I just wanted to give you what's rightfully yours, he said, handing her a folder. Inside was a partnership contract. Half of it is yours. It always was. She looked at the paper coldly. You think a percentage fixes what you did? Elijah sighed. No, but maybe it shows what I want to build moving forward. Grace placed the folder on the table. You lied. You looked me in the eyes, tasted my cake, listened to stories about my grandmother, and lied. Her voice trembled between pain and restrained anger. You could have told the truth, but you chose to be just another man hiding behind his power. I know, he replied quietly, and I don't expect your forgiveness right away. I just want you to know that nothing between us was fake. Every laugh, every silence, every shared peace, it was all real to me. Grace crossed her arms. Maybe it was, but I deserved to know who I was sharing it with. The silence between them was thick, full of things that couldn't be undone. She left the kitchen and returned to the front. She served customers with her usual kindness, but the light in her eyes had dimmed. Elijah watched from a distance, feeling small. In the place he had rebuilt so carefully, he now felt the most broken. Sometimes, restoring the space is easy. Restoring trust is not. The end of the day, Grace climbed the stairs to the small room where her grandmother used to read recipes. She sat in the old armchair, opened her fabric-covered notebook, and wrote. Not every cake bakes the same. Sometimes, it takes low heat, patience, and distance. Then maybe, just maybe, you can try again. She closed the notebook gently. It wasn't a goodbye, but it wasn't quite a new beginning either. Elijah didn't return the next day. Or the next. The bakery continued to thrive, with lines at the door and praise for the renovations. But the bench where he used to sit remained empty. And despite the buzz, Grace missed the pause he brought. The comfortable silence. The way he remembered details no one else noticed. One evening, as she was closing up, she found a letter left under the wooden tray. It was from him. The handwriting was firm, but with traces of vulnerability. If you ever make the orange cake again and it feels like something's missing, maybe it's me. I'm not asking to come back. I just want you to know that what we built, even in silence, remains with me. Grace tucked the letter between the pages of her recipe notebook. She read it more than once, and for the first time in days, she let the tears fall without resistance. Not because she was weak, but because allowing herself to feel was a kind of strength, a way of cleaning the wound before even thinking of healing it. The following week, a child brought a jar of honey to the bakery with a note. He said it's the same kind your grandma used, and that you'd know what to do with it. Grace held the jar in silence for several minutes. The glass was warm from the morning sun, but what truly warmed her was the memory of that first simple gesture, now holding new meaning. She didn't respond. Not immediately, but that night, as she locked the door, she left a note hanging on the front window. Today we have orange cake with honey, house recipe, but what matters most is who you share it with. It was her way of saying, the wound was still open, but there was space to heal, and maybe to begin again. The next morning, Elijah arrived early. Before the city woke, he found the bakery still dark, but the door was slightly ajar. Inside, the scent of the sweetest cake he'd ever known drifted through the air. He smiled, not with excitement, but with the quiet knowing that forgiveness can't be demanded. It has to be earned. And sometimes, it takes time. Grace appeared. in the kitchen with a cup of tea in her hands. She didn't speak, just offered him a warm slice on a blue plate. Elijah took it in silence, and in that simple gesture, he understood she hadn't taken him back yet. But she also wasn't pushing him away anymore. And for someone who had caused pain, that was the first step toward healing. They ate slowly, like before. Their glances were still cautious, but the silence between them was once again gentle. And deep down, both knew some wounds only heal when we have the courage to stay, even if it means bleeding a little longer. After the quiet meal, Elijah stood up slowly, as if honoring her pace. He walked to the door, but before leaving, he turned to her. "Thank you for letting me in, even with the windows still closed." She simply nodded, holding her cup with both hands. Inside, something stirred, not full forgiveness, but not rejection either. It was that in-between space between pain and hope, where real things often bloom slowly. In the window display, the morning sun began to shine through the glass, lighting up the recipe books and the jars of homemade cookies. Grace watched his silhouette fade down the sidewalk, and, for the first time since it all began, she didn't feel anger. She felt longing, but a different kind, the kind that doesn't burn, just reminds you how much something mattered. And in that silent recognition, she understood it wasn't yet time for a yes, but maybe it was no longer time for a no. She returned to the kitchen and wrote in her notebook, "Wounds are not the end. They're just the way life marks where something needed to be remade with more truth." She closed the notebook and smiled to herself, because deep down, she knew those who have the courage to open a wound might also have the courage to heal it together. And maybe, just maybe, that love was still baking slowly on low heat. In the days that followed, the bakery returned to its usual rhythm, light and lively. The smell of homemade cakes still filled the air, customers smiled as they walked in, and Grace did her job with the same quiet excellence as always. But there was one empty spot no one talked about, the bench by the window where Elijah used to sit. His absence felt like a missing ingredient in a recipe. Everything seemed right, but the flavor was off. Grace didn't ask about him, not out loud, but her eyes sometimes swept the sidewalk outside, as if hoping, without admitting. At night, she would reopen the recipe notebook and find old doodles with his name scribbled in the margins. She didn't know if it was longing, regret, or confusion. She only knew that something in her hadn't fully closed, and maybe it wasn't supposed to. Elijah, on the other hand, avoided the bakery street. Not out of pride, but out of respect. He felt she needed space, a chance to breathe without his shadow. But every morning, as he made his own coffee at home, he remembered the smell of Grace's cake, the way she adjusted her apron, the way she looked at recipes as if they held memories. The longing was constant, silent, and bitter. On the third night away from the bakery, Elijah got an unexpected visit. It was his mother's former secretary, holding an envelope. "She wrote this before she passed," the woman said. "She asked me to give it to you only when you fell in love, truly." Elijah said nothing. He opened the letter with trembling hands. The words were simple, but direct. "When you find someone who sees past your facade, don't let her go out of fear. True love is rare, and it comes with no guarantees." The letter stirred something in him. His mother had always seen what no one else could. That night, Elijah walked to the bakery. He didn't go in. He just stood across the street, watching the glowing sign. He knew Grace wasn't ready yet, but he also knew that time alone doesn't heal everything. Sometimes, healing comes from the one who stays, even without certainty. The next day, Grace found a note left at the door. "I still remember the smell of your cake, even miles away. If you ever feel like teaching me again, I'll be waiting." She folded the note slowly, placed it in her pocket, and took a deep breath. It felt like his absence was beginning to turn into presence again, not physical, but emotional. His memory no longer hurt the same. It was longing with sweetness. Life at the bakery went on. But subtle changes appeared. Grace started leaving an extra slice of cake on the tray, brewing one more cup of coffee than necessary, folding a napkin with extra care. No one noticed, but it was as if she were making space, preparing just in case he returned. Her quiet way of saying, "There's still room." One overcast morning, while cleaning the front display, she saw an elderly woman stumble on the sidewalk. Grace rushed to help. It was one of Elijah's former customers, someone who hadn't visited in ages. "You care for this place the way some people care for people," the woman said, holding Grace's arm. "That's why he fell in love with you." Grace froze. He said that. He said it with his eyes, and with his silences. Grace nodded in thanks, though her voice cracked. She wasn't ready to hear that, and yet she needed to. That afternoon, Grace decided to visit her grandmother's old house. It had been a while. She needed clarity. On the way, she remembered the time Elijah made a mess trying to sift flour and ended up covered in it. She chuckled. It was in those little moments that he lingered. In the absence, the fragments of memory, the small repeated gestures. When she arrived, the garden was dry. But near the fence, a new lavender sprout had been planted, with a small wooden sign handwritten. "So the scent never lets you forget what bloomed here." Elijah had been there. Grace knelt by the plant, letting tears fall softly like early autumn wind. His absence wasn't punishment. It was pause, space for her to figure out what she truly wanted. She returned home with teary eyes, but a lighter heart. That night, she made chocolate cake with strawberries, the same one they had shared on their first day. She cut 2 slices, one for herself, the other she left on the counter with a note. "If you want to come back, there's a place at the table." It wasn't a demand, nor a plea, just an opening. And that was all she could offer in that moment. Elijah read the note the next day. The bakery manager handed it to him without a word. As he read it, he didn't smile, but he closed his eyes for a few seconds, like someone receiving something too precious to express. He knew what it meant, and he also knew there were still steps to take. But now, the path was clearer. The next morning, he came. He didn't go in. He stood at the door, looking in with his usual calm eyes. Grace saw him and walked over. She didn't say hi or ask anything. She just handed him a slice of cake wrapped in a napkin with his name scribbled on it. Elijah took it gently, brushing her hand. There was a silence between them filled with tenderness, the kind that only exists between people who've been broken and choose to rebuild together. They sat on the same bench as always. There was no thrill, just calm. Elijah looked around. "You kept everything the same," Grace replied. "Some things only make sense like that." He nodded. "And others, we learn again." Time felt like it had rewound. But both knew they were in a different place now. More mature, more honest, more whole. "I brought something to show you," he said, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. It was the recipe journal he'd started on his own, inspired by her. Pages were stained with syrup, filled with measurement mistakes and notes like, "Grace would do this better." She smiled as she flipped through it. "You're awful with baking powder." He laughed. "But I'm getting better. And now I have someone to teach me." The coffee sat cooling in their cups, unnoticed. They were too caught up in remembering. That presence is the one ingredient you can't go without. Elijah looked at her and said quietly, "If I could go back to that first day, I'd tell you who I really was. But maybe, deep down, it was you who showed me who I truly am." Grace placed her hand over his on the table. "Maybe we need to get lost to understand where we really belong." He nodded, and for the first time, there was no more doubt. Only the certainty that their love, like the best cakes, took time, heat, and courage to rise. In the display window, the sign glowed gently. "Sweet Memory." But now, it wasn't just the name of a place. It was the name of a story, one made of pauses, mistakes, new beginnings, and an absence that, instead of separating, had taught them the beauty of staying. That night, after closing the bakery, Grace sat alone in the kitchen, apron still stained with chocolate. She turned on only the warm stove light and stayed there, listening to the silence. On the counter, her recipe book and Elijah's were open, side by side. They were different, one with elegant, old handwriting, the other clumsy and new. But together, they told the same story. Two people who learned to love by mixing what they had, even without knowing the exact measure. She ran her fingers across the pages and whispered, "Maybe love isn't made of promises, but of presence." And she understood, right there, that not every absence is abandonment. Sometimes, it's just a pause, to feel what still needs to be healed. Elijah wasn't perfect, but he was there. He had returned with his heart in his hands and the humility of someone who wanted to learn, not just recipes, but the right way to stay. And for Grace, that was worth more than any rehearsed apology. Meanwhile, outside, Elijah looked up at the dark sky, hands in his pockets and a heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Not because everything was solved, but because now they were in sync. He wasn't in a hurry. He had learned that the best things take time to bake. And Grace, she was the kind of love you don't serve cold, but warm, with truth, presence, and just a little hope. Autumn began painting the city's trees with golden and orange hues. In the bakery window, dry leaves discreetly decorated the corners, like a whisper of the season of new beginnings. Grace woke up early that Saturday and somehow just knew that day would be different. There was something in the air, maybe calm, maybe an answer. She opened her recipe book and stopped on the page she had avoided for months. Forgiveness cake, written by her grandmother. She took a deep breath. It was time. She gathered the ingredients with steady hands, though her heart raced. As she cracked the eggs and sifted the flour, she thought of every time she hesitated to love again, of every time she trusted and was left behind. But she also remembered Elijah's eyes, their conversations over slices of pie, the silent letters exchanged through gestures. And she understood, forgiving isn't erasing the past. It's deciding it won't shape your future anymore. Elijah arrived at the bakery later than usual. He was nervous, holding a small envelope. When he walked in, he saw Grace wearing a new apron, arranging dried flowers on the center table. She looked at him, not surprised, but calm, like someone who had already expected his arrival. He approached slowly, as if approaching an altar. "I brought something. It's not much, but it's everything I am today." She took the envelope carefully. Inside, a handwritten letter. "Grace, if you're reading this, it means I found the courage. The courage to say I don't want to pretend anymore. That my greatest achievement wasn't saving a bakery. It was being saved by it. By you. If you'll let me stay, I promise I won't be perfect, only present." Grace read the letter with teary eyes, but she didn't cry, because she knew that truth doesn't need tears to be felt. Without a word, she walked to the oven and pulled out a freshly baked cake. The glaze was still warm, and the scent of vanilla mixed with orange filled the air. She cut 2 slices, one for him, one for her. They sat down together, like in the beginning. But now there were no masks, no misunderstandings. Just 2 hearts willing to start again, even without knowing how it would end. "This cake," Elijah began, "tastes like a new beginning." Grace smiled. "Tastes like courage. It's what I needed to forgive you." He took a deep breath, touching his coffee cup as if anchoring himself. "And I needed your strength to realize I don't have to hide anymore. Not behind money. Not behind who they expect me to be." It was the most honest conversation they had ever had, and it was in silence that it had the deepest effect. After coffee, they sat there watching the street outside. Children laughing, couples walking in with loving glances, regulars ordering the usual. It was like the bakery had become the heart of the town again, and theirs too. Elijah looked around. "I want this place to carry your name. I want people to know who saved all this." Grace shook her head. "The name is right. What matters is what we do with what's left." On Monday, they officially announced the reopening. But this time, with no fanfare, just a small news sign beside the door reading, "The Last Slice, where stories continue." Customers were moved. Many knew the journey, even if in fragments. Others simply felt something special there, a warmth that didn't come from the oven, but from the people behind the counter. Grace and Elijah split the responsibilities naturally. She handled the recipes and the heart of the kitchen. He, the management, and the listening. He no longer needed to pretend he knew everything. And that, to him, was freeing. For the first time, he felt whole. Even if he messed up the measurements, burned the bottom of the pan, or forgot the salt, he was where he wanted to be. Every Thursday, they served the forgiveness cake as the house special. It was the most requested item, not just for the taste, but for the story. Grace would tell customers, "This is the only cake that only works once you choose to move on." And people would smile, sometimes through tears, because they knew they were eating more than dessert. They were tasting affection. One quiet afternoon, Elijah put on a slow song on the old record player. Grace walked into the dining room, wiping her hands on her apron. He held out a hand. "May I have this dance?" She hesitated, then laughed. "We're in the middle of business hours." "So what?" he replied, gently pulling her in. They danced between the empty tables, with the scent of sugar and coffee as their witnesses. It was like time paused to watch love dance. That night, Elijah prepared a surprise. He showed Grace a project plan for a new experimental kitchen in the back of the bakery. "I don't just want to sell cakes. I want to teach, to share what I learned from you." Grace read the sketches with tears in her eyes. "You really think people would want to learn from me?" Elijah held her hand. "People need someone like you, someone who turns pain into recipes, who heals with cake." The project came to life within weeks. Children, adults, even elders came to learn old recipes and invent new ones. But the first class was taught by Grace and Elijah together. They started with the last slice. While cooking, they told the story, no names, no drama, just truth. And the attentive eyes of the class understood. Sometimes, life's ingredients are simple, but the courage to mix them changes everything. At the end of the class, a child raised their hand and asked, "How do you know when the forgiveness cake is ready?" Grace smiled and replied, "When its smell reminds you of all the things you had the courage to keep going for, even when afraid." Elijah looked at her with pride. That's why he loved her. Not for her strength or talent, but for the tenderness with which she handled hard things. On the back porch, they sat under blankets, sipping tea, listening to the wind rustling dry leaves. "You know what?" Elijah said, gazing at the sky. "Life with you tastes like home." Grace rested her head on his shoulder. "And you smell like a fresh start." Silence beside him no longer hurt. On the contrary, it healed. It was silence with meaning. The bakery sign now glowed with more warmth. The last slice was no longer just a name. It was a symbol of everything built with patience, surrender, and truth. People came and went, but all could feel something different lived there. And it wasn't just the cake. It was the love that, though once wounded, had the courage to stay. That night, before bed, Grace wrote one final line in her notebook. Forgiveness has no exact recipe, but if there's presence, listening, and the will to make it work, it's already a good start. She closed the page, certain that some stories, when mixed just right, become eternal, even if scarred along the way. Winter arrived slowly, painting the mornings with fog and longer silences. The bakery, however, remained alive, warmed by more than just the oven. It was the presence of Grace and Elijah that filled every corner, every pause, every spoonful. Served. They hadn't changed the world, but they had changed theirs. And that was enough. Now, they shared their routine the way one shares a home, with space, respect, and the small joys of everyday life. Grace woke before sunrise and put the kettle on. Elijah prepared the ingredients while trying, often with mistakes and laughter. to memorize the recipes without the notebook. She pretended to scold him, but deep down, she loved teaching him again. The kitchen had become sacred ground, where old wounds gave way to inside jokes. Knowing glances and scents that healed more than words ever could, that on a freezing Saturday, they decided to host a community cake night. Each month, they chose an organization to donate desserts and time. Elijah, who once believed helping meant simply writing checks, now discovered the power of placing a warm slice of cake into someone's hands. Grace smiled watching him fumble with baking pans and packaging, but what truly moved her was the sincerity in his eyes, the kind of gratitude you can't fake. That night, they came home exhausted, but happy. Grace collapsed onto the couch, barefoot, and Elijah appeared with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. They sat in silence, simply listening to each other breathe. "Have you ever thought about writing all this down?" he asked. She raised an eyebrow. "Writing what?" "Our story. Since the last slice." She laughed. "But we haven't even finished living it." He replied. "Maybe that's what makes it a good one." The experimental kitchen project grew. Students started coming from other towns. It became more than cooking. It was a place where people learned to turn memories into nourishment. Grace watched it all with a new kind of pride. She no longer carried pain as identity. Now, she carried stories that helped others heal, too. And Elijah? He finally understood that success meant being able to touch someone's life, and stayed at one of the workshops. An 8-year-old girl asked, "What is real love?" Grace paused and answered, "It's when you share the best of yourself, even when you don't have much." Elijah looked at her with tenderness, because that's exactly what she had done for him since the very first day. Since the last slice, the 1-year anniversary of the bakery arrived like a quiet celebration. No grand party, just a photo wall, customer notes, recipes hanging on, twined with colorful clips. In the center, a picture of Grace and Elijah laughing, covered in flour. It was simple. It was real. It was home. And everyone who walked in felt that. Even if they couldn't explain at the end of the day, after everyone had left, Elijah took Grace to the back. He had something to show her. A small wooden plaque on the door of the old pantry, now renovated. It read, "Grace Monroe Room, where we learn that cake also heals." She smiled, moved. "You're still full of surprises?" "Only for the ones who are worth it," he replied. And right there, on the wooden floor, he kissed her. Night fell with a comforting silence. Inside the bakery, only the 2 of them remained, sitting on the floor, surrounded by crumbs and warm yellow lights. "Did you know I was coming back?" he asked, his head resting on her shoulder. "No, but I set the table anyway," she replied, in that voice of someone who trusts, without guarantees, because their love was never certain, but it was always true. The following week, Elijah gathered the team for an announcement. He pulled a contract from his pocket. Grace was now officially the majority partner. He would remain in the background, helping wherever needed. "This story is hers," he said. "I just came to learn the most important part, how to serve." Grace's eyes sparkled, not because of the paper, but because of the gesture. It was the first time someone didn't try to be the center, but chose to be the support. That night, when she returned home, she found a note on top of her recipe notebook. "Whenever you're ready to marry me, just let me know. I'm not in a rush. I'm just sure." Grace smiled. She didn't answer with words, but she placed a red ribbon on that page, the one she used for her most special recipes, because their love now had time. And more than that, it had roots. Sundays became just for them. Lazy breakfasts, half-read books, old music playing from the record player. Sometimes they didn't say a word all day, but they'd return to each other with just a glance, a hand touch, a cake in the oven. Because their language didn't need words. It needed presence. That on one of those Sundays, Elijah asked, "Do you still feel afraid?" Grace thought before replying, "Sometimes, but now I know I can feel afraid and still stay. Because you make me feel at home. And I've learned that love, when it's homemade, also has cracks. But even so, it's the best kind of love there is. They built a life between flour, sugar, and daily choices. It wasn't always easy. There were silent days, rush days, but they always returned to the same place, the table where it all began. There, every meal, every cake, every shared slice was a reminder that the most beautiful kind of love doesn't shout. It stays. One day, Grace watched Elijah stumble through a new recipe, making a glorious mess of chocolate. And she thought, who would have thought the delivery guy would become my favorite recipe? Not because he was perfect, but because he was made of truth, mistakes, new beginnings. And the hardest ingredient of all, patience. The end of winter, Grace placed a new recipe in the window display. The name? When Love is Homemade. Next to it, a small note. This cake was born from shared silences, revealed secrets, and the courage to start again. It's not perfect, but it's real, and that's why it's the most requested in the house. People started ordering it as if asking for advice. They wanted more than flavor. They wanted story. They wanted what everyone longs for, but few dare to live. A love that doesn't need to shine, just to be true. And there, between pots and pieces of memory, Elijah and Grace kept building their life. One choice at a time, one recipe at a time, one forgiveness at a time. Because in the end, the most beautiful love is the one that knows how to blend the ordinary with care, silence with presence, forgiveness with warmth, the kind of love you don't find ready-made. You make it at home. And so, Grace and Elijah understood that true love doesn't need to be grand. It just needs to be real. Made of listening, of small gestures, of second chances, of the courage to start over, even after the cracks. Because the love that stays is the love that chooses to remain every single day. Now, tell me, have you ever shared your last slice with someone who truly deserved it? If this story touched your heart, like this video so more people can experience the power of a love built through presence. Share it with someone you would choose to stay. Comment below. Do you believe the strongest love is the one that knows how to be simple? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that real love still exists. Here, the stories don't end. They live on inside those who feel them.